Hi, I'm Rebecca Holcombe. Thank you for joining us. We're here today to talk about accountability, but more specifically, what do we want our students to know and be able to do? And how will we know if they can do it? We're here today with Dan French. He's from the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union, and he's done a tremendous amount of work around the state around personalization and assessment, and can speak to us about that work. Also here today is Chris Case from the Agency of Education. He's a former teacher, has depth of knowledge in the arts, and he's also working closely at the agency with us on better plans for how we assess student learning. And also here today is Carol Brigham, who's a school board chair, a parent, and a longtime advocate for Vermont children. And she's here today from the Rutland Northeast Supervisory Union, and we look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you. At the agency, our goal is to improve the learning of every student in the state, and to do it continuously across all critical outcomes for Vermont students. We also know that we can't test our way into better schools. We need to find better ways to make sure that every child is understood as an individual and that we know what their strengths are and build on their strengths consistently to ensure that they're always growing towards our goals for them. Today, I'd love to start with you, Dan. If you could talk to us a little bit. I know that you've worked tremendously in your district with assessment, but also with technology, and there's a whole number of opportunities you see opening up to help us personalize learning for our students. Maybe you could talk about that and also talk about those in the context of federal accountability.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I think it's in many ways a very exciting time in education. I think actually that's a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. And we are definitely in interesting times. On the one hand, I think from a technological perspective, there's some wonderful opportunities for us in Vermont in particular to do what we've always wanted to do, which is to serve the aspirational needs of every student. The news, I think, now is we now, for the first time in history, have the tools to actually manage that and to do that. So that's what's really exciting. I think, on the other hand, you know, as a local leader, superintendent, it's been a very challenging 10 years, so to speak, with the No Child Left Behind Act, and particularly, I think, at the end of the accountability system that we're at now, where virtually every school is going to be identified as a failing school. It's been a challenge at the local level to brook those two. On the one hand, the opportunities to personalize and to meet the learning aspirations of every child. On the other hand, what has turned into a tremendous political challenge to engage with our communities about, you know, what do the results mean, what does accountability mean from a school perspective. So.
Do you think the politics are making it difficult for you to personalize?
Very, very much so. I think it's not just the political headwind, but it just makes it really hard to explain to local folks. So I think on the one hand, you know, once again, there's always been, I think, an interest in meeting the individual, unique learning aspirations of every child. We've had that as a goal in our state for at least 100 years. And now we can actually do it. So we can explain fairly easily and demonstrate to parents, you know, here's what we can do in terms of assessment, here's what we can do in terms of documenting student learning, which is what we say in technology. We have all kinds of ways to document student learning. On the other hand, we've had to explain these test results and an accountability system. And it's to a certain extent undermines their confidence in their institutions and their educational leaders. So it's hard to restore their confidence as we're trying to engage in this new personalization effort through technology. So it's been very challenging.
So what do test scores mean to people in your district? I mean, you say it makes it difficult because it erodes the credibility of your district. Why is that a problem? I mean, don't test scores tell us something?
Yeah, I think, you know, from the personalization aspect with the new assessment tools, we can really start to look at where students are learning, we say on an equal increment scale. It's like if you were to put a ruler out and say, you know, where are you on that ruler as a learner? You're at 3, so your next step is 4, and so forth. And if we can test students on that ruler, regardless of what grade level they're on, we might find some 8th graders on 2 on the ruler, we might find some 2nd graders on 8 on the ruler. And I think that's one of the things that's exciting, is that today, we find kids coming in all over that continuum. You know, it's possible today for many parents to, you know, through their resources, the internet and what have you, to really prepare their students well before they even enter school. At the same time, we have students coming to school who really are still relying on school to teach them how to read, and all those possibilities are now present in the classroom. So, you know, we used to talk about differentiation as a pedagogical strategy, you know, the idea of a teacher sort of working in isolation and trying to meet the individual learning needs of students. With technology now, with personalization, is really now to equip teachers working with their peers systematically across the grades to be able to teach anyone on that ruler, regardless of where they are. So it's a tremendous challenging time for teachers, but it's also very exciting. And I think the challenge from back to the accountability end is the accountability system really just talks about the grade level competence of students. So, if we took those same students on the ruler, so to speak, if the ones that are 8s are going to have met the standard, regardless of what the input was in the classroom to get them there. So it really doesn't tell us enough about what's going on in the classroom. It doesn't really give us the state or national accountability data. It doesn't give us information on how our professional development's working or how our curriculum's working. And once again, the political end in terms of a policy level, it's difficult to explain to the community how students, for instance, could be failing that test or not doing well in that test, or the school's not doing well in that test, but here are other indicators that clearly show the school is doing very well. So we have high schools in our area that honestly score quite poorly on NECAP, but their students score tremendously well on SATs, they get into excellent colleges and so forth. So that disconnect is difficult as a local leader to make sense of for people.
So I'm hearing a number of things. One is that the one-size-fits-all doesn't really give you the kind of specialized data that teachers need to make sure that they tailor the instruction to the individual child. But I'm also hearing that that somehow we'll start with there. That's a good thing. I want to go to you, Carol, because as a school board member, you're responsible for making decisions around budgets, about looking at the school and asking what the goals are for the students in your school, and then looking at the data coming out of your school and asking yourself, is the school and the opportunities we're providing our students getting them where they need to go? Are they serving the intent of our program? What do you look for in an accountability model?
Something that is going to allow the student to show their progress on their terms. And I don't know if Dan has, we have the tools yet. We need support from the state and each other to get those tools so that a student who may not do well at any kind of written test or even a computerized test can show that they can then do their potential at their level and know that they can make a mistake and learn from that mistake and still move on and succeed into the next step.
So what I'm hearing from both you and Dan is this shift. We're not so interested in just how well our students do, but I'm hearing both of you say that we need a better system that helps us understand what to do next, the next step. And it's really focusing on growth. It's not focusing.
Right. Yeah, I think the growth aspect is a critical element. And we look at it too. I mean, the other, I think, critical lens at a local level is to say, how much time are we going to spend on assessment? To what extent are we disrupting the regular teaching in the classroom? Because we know direct instruction is still probably the most effective means to improve student learning. So if we start with that assumption or that lens of, well, how much time are we going to spend on assessment, then it really becomes important that assessment become very efficient in terms of getting us lots of data in a very quick manner. And not to harp on the technology end, but that's what the promise of some of the new tools is, that in a relatively small amount of time we can get a lot of information from those assessments. And we talk about, in terms of measuring the efficiency of assessment in our district, that to be an efficient assessment, it has to satisfy 3 levels in the organization simultaneously. The one level is to give the teachers the information they need and give students the information they need to set learning goals, and that needs to be in their hands fairly quickly after the test has been taken. The second level is to give administration and teachers the ability to evaluate the success of our programs. So, our curriculum development, professional development, and our assessment models themselves need to be evaluated. We need to be able to look at the outcomes for students and to determine whether they're successful or not. And the third level is what Carol was talking about, is at the policy level, at the local level, to school boards, so they can provide assurance to their local communities that the community desired ends, if you will, are being achieved. So if we can get assessments to satisfy all 3 of those levels in the organization, then we have the ability, firstly, to minimize the impact on instructional time, but secondly, we have the ability to really put, I wouldn't say pressure in a positive way, put pressure on the organization to improve. And that's, I think has been the exciting part in our organization, is really to connect the teachers across district boundaries, across school boundaries, and give them the same common objective sort of assessment tools to put in their hands and to have them make sense of it, while at the same time the school boards are able to speak to those results in their community. So, and that's been a challenge with the federal assessment. As you know, we don't get the results in a timely manner. And although it's, like the NECAP is a very reliable assessment, because we're not able to get those results in a timely manner to take action steps on it, it really becomes almost meaningless of what we can do in terms of organizational improvement.
So I'm going to push back on you a little bit because,
Right.
as you know, we're leaving the kneecaps
Yeah.
behind. And actually, I would question whether they were reliable for the high-performing and the low-performing students. But I think moving forward, we're using a computer adaptive test, the Smart
Right.
Balanced Assessment, which will probably have very reliable scores for students across the distribution. It will also have with it some tools, some formative assessment tools and some interim assessments that local school districts can choose to use if they wish to get that just-in-time data.
Right.
Is that enough for you, Carol? If schools have this just-in-time data on how students are doing relative to those standards?
I think not, because it's only going to be covering certain content. I mean, language, arts, and math for the start, and then science.
As much as we've tried to look at it from this reliability issue, because I think it is very important to have a standardized assessment that we can use normative data from around the country, and it provides parents assurance and provides the community assurance that we're benchmarking against something that's a known entity. So that's a very important component. On the other hand, that needs to be balanced with an understanding that the tests, firstly, don't measure everything, as Carol's saying, but when we've done broad community engagement in our communities across the board pretty much come back with the understanding that they want to see students succeed in core academics, but there's a couple other areas that are equally as important, and one of them is this idea of civic ethics, or the idea that students should learn leadership, should learn how to do democracy, and secondly, this issue of dispositions towards learning. They must learn how to be creative, resilient, persevere. And we've had to work hard to create systems of we call monitoring or accountability, so that we can provide our boards assurance that the school is indeed doing that. And I think that's what we come back to, why schools need to continue to exist. I mean, it's a great question to have. Some people would say in a technological era, why do we still need to have schools? Well, we can hit that first quadrant, the core academics, with the technology, but we can't really do the dispositions and the civic ethics outside of a social school environment. And that's why schools are so critical in Vermont, in our communities, is that it's really, as Dewey would say, all learning social. We need to really focus on that learning environment so the kids have our values and the values they need to have to be successful in what's going to be a much larger democracy.
Chris, I was hoping you could weigh in as well. I mean, you have the depth of knowledge in arts education, and I know you've thought a lot about creativity, and also as someone who works closely at the agency with the education quality standards, you've been thinking about the broad spectrum of skills and critical goals that we have for our students. What gets left out if you just focus on test scores, and what are some of the things that you're working on in your work to try to measure and promote learning and growth around the kinds of indicators that Dan's talking about?
Yeah, well, I think to start with, it's exciting to hear, because I feel like the conversation that we're having around accountability really mirrored the concerns that we're hearing from the field and that Dan's spoken to and that Carol's spoken to. So that's exciting to start with. I think it's a scary exciting, but it's still exciting. I think when looking at, because the work that I had prior to doing accountability work, that we're doing now together, was work out in the field in schools, looking at DCAP tests, scores, and trying to have some kind of a conversation about what that meant for school performance and accountability. And it was always a very limited conversation. You're going in with math scores and English scores, and even within the scope of what you're bringing into a conversation around math and English, it's still a limited conversation. So somebody that comes from an arts background that's pretty passionate about the arts, it's exciting to now see art curriculum content standards reflected in EQS and the education quality standards, which means that there's going to be a new expectation around coming up with some kind of an assessment system to look at how students are learning and tied to arts, tied to civic engagement, tied to some of the transferable skills that Dan mentioned around creativity and other things too. So the potential for this as a more comprehensive tool for not just, I think, and I think getting away from the idea too of solely using this as a method of assessing school performance and really looking at it as a way to think about supporting kids and supporting teachers and providing deeper information to SUs and to districts and to schools about how they're doing and what maybe they could be looking at or what they could be sharing with the public about, what's really working in their schools. I think that's all very exciting. And so,
what's evidence? I mean, if a child has developed capability in the arts, how do you know?
Right. So I think that that's part of what we're trying to examine at the agency. And I think that to start with, we know from doing this work that it's a very complex conversation, and that with all the technological tools that we have available to us and all these different models that are research driven, that there are a lot of different things that we could choose from potentially to kind of put into a tool basket or a toolkit. So I think that to start with, it's we haven't identified one approach yet to this work that we've settled on, and I think that that's going to come with a lot of input from the field and time and conversation. But knowing that there's an expectation around articulating what proficiency should look like in each of those content areas, and supplementing or complementing what standardized tests can do in measuring proficiency with what we can learn through performance assessments. And also looking to what Dan was talking about the idea of getting this kind of summative, this once a year, or this kind of final answer, a score that gives you a black and white indication of what a kid knows, moving away from that and thinking about ongoing feedback that would really be immediately following the delivery of a test that would give you some kind of rolling information about where kids are and where teachers are, and that's something else that we're looking at too. So those are all, without knowing the details around what we're specifically measuring, I think that we're starting to identify models that could potentially help us to provide a more comprehensive picture for schools.
I think that's great, because one of the roles I think the state should be is to be able to scale or create some infrastructure for all our schools to participate in a system like that. So, we as a state could, deploy a statewide e-portfolio system that not only had the ability to display the art, but also had the ability for teachers to create the rubrics or the methodologies by which they would rate the art.
Yeah.
And that can be in a single system, and that allows us to bring those same tools to a rural school like Canaan, where I used to work,
Yeah.
the same tools that they have in Chittenden County. So I think
Which
that's
is
the
really
role.
exciting.
As much as we're looking at a state system or responding to the federal needs, I think we also have the ability as a state to think about building out that infrastructure in a
Yeah.
way to serve all our schools, even
And
the most small schools.
That's what we're looking at now,
Yeah.
which is really exciting to be having this conversation, because I think that we're looking at identifying a set of graduation standards that are going to represent proficiency across the content areas, curriculum content areas that are identified in the new education quality standards, which include math and English, but they also include science and the arts and social studies and the kind of nebulous transferable skills that are like creativity and civic engagement too. And so we're looking at some graduation standards that will help to kind of frame what proficiency in those things looks like, but then we're looking at to what degree should performance assessment to help us learn how kids are doing relative to those standards be standardized? Are we talking about statewide portfolios? Are we talking about a network of locally constructed performance assessments that are standardized enough so that there's validity across regions when you're looking at assessment, but where there's still some control given to local organizations to really develop something that's relevant to their needs. So trying to find that balance.
It strikes me that both of what you're talking about, though, is a system that incorporates a stronger role for professional voice and professional judgment by educators, but also that's rooted in the community, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think that's the promise of it. It also can provide broader public access to, if you want to see the best student artwork in our schools and, involving artists in our community or just lay people to comment on that and to, become involved and really, you can see the wonderful things that are going on. That's great.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to go back to that. I mean, one of the points that you were making, Chris, is that we're talking about what are our common goals and how we know if students have met them. What's the right balance between common goals and then local voice in developing the strategy for reaching those goals? I mean, you've spoken, Dan, about the need for the person closest to the learning, the teacher,
Right.
to really have the information that helps them move students towards the goals. And Carol, you've spoken to me in other conversations about how the journey every child takes is different.
Yes.
So you really need that local role. So what is the role of local participation and local work at the school in terms of fostering the kind of growth I think we all value for kids?
Well, we have to support every one of those children and give them all that they need to become their potential. So the local role, I mean, we're their family. I mean, it takes a village to show them that they belong to our village. So we have to be asking them questions and involving them in the local community, as well as supporting them in the school system. So everyone has a role.
One of the reasons, or when you think about the rationales for test-based accountability, was it was seen as a way to drive equity issues. And I know that's something that's dear to the heart of everybody at this table, because there were groups that were historically underserved. And by putting out scores and breaking them out in terms of subgroups, we began to see that different students were more or less successful in our system. For example, we know in Vermont that the young men from low-income backgrounds in our schools tend not to have the same level of skill in the tested subjects that some other students do. What's wrong with that? I mean, what's wrong with test-based accountability if it serves that equity goal? And that Vermont chose not to pursue a waiver. If we had pursued a waiver, we would have been required to evaluate our teachers based on test scores. For the sake of argument, why wouldn't that work? Why wouldn't having strong accountability based on the gains that we see on these tests be important, particularly if they're supported by the kinds of formative assessments you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one to tackle, because I think we know even in our own state and nationally, there are subgroups that are really struggle receiving an equal educational opportunity. On the other hand, I think, in my opinion, what we've seen from No Child Left Behind Act has been a real exaggeration, an inappropriate one, in terms of placing a lot of pressure on those individuals and placing a lot of pressures on those schools, when really the broader issues are ones of poverty and things that the schools don't themselves control. So I think we have to acknowledge that, but I think with Carol often speaks about just what does that feel like for individual kids. What does that make them feel like, and is that really how you get kids, those subgroups, to perform better, by punishing them essentially in a public political arena? I don't know. Does that you point to your heart, right?
Yes, I did. It is. It hurts right here, because you're putting the pressure of the state on these scores that are intended to show a failure. So that's wrong. That's totally wrong. They should be able to know they're going to succeed. They can make mistakes, succeed, and continue, and be accepted into the community as who they are, and learn at their level, at their speed, and become potential great citizens, and not be labeled a failure, because as soon as you fail, you think you can't continue. So, and I've seen it in my own family. I've seen it. It's just not fair. It's just not fair. So it is an inequity, even though it may show where the inequities are. But did that really solve the problem? And it puts a lot of pressure on those students and those families of those students to have to go through the struggle for this. So, it's wrong. I think it is wrong.
I also would say educationally, it's just not developmentally appropriate.
It's not. It's the opposite of what we're trying to do.
Kids need room to grow, and not all kids, learn at the same time. And I was principal of a K through 12 school, and not to pick on the boys, but I'd often see boys who didn't get their act together until sophomore year, or maybe when they're seniors, or then suddenly after graduation, they intellectually figure out, wow, this is pretty interesting. But to mark a seventh grader as a failure, that's really.
But
just,
is it the test that's marking them as failures, or is it the way we're using it? Because the test is just a test.
Yeah,
right?
the test is the test.
Right.
I think it's really the irresponsibility that's been associated with the accountability model, the labeling. That's really been the problem. I mean, we can take the data lots of different ways, but when we start labeling children and politically start doing some things with that information, that's where the problem begins.
Well, if that's just at some level, if you can prove that you're the worst in the group, it's okay, so they acknowledge, okay, I'm the worst, and I can stay being the worst too. I mean, I can play this all day, but, they're also compared to people who they think are put up as the ideal student. And I think, and we forget that, because we lose track of where we were. But when you put an ideal person in the middle, and we're all supposed to be like that, it's not right. And if you really want to go to the hayfield, I'll go to the hayfield, because if my dad had planted alfalfa on all the fields that he owned, he would have been disappointed, because alfalfa is not going to grow on every field, in the 300-acre farm. So you need to know what to grow in the right places and what to push kids to do to be excellent. My son, again, I won't go to it, but he's going to be an excellent plumber someday, and my daughter will have a big college bill that she will take years and years to pay off. And will they ever end up equally? No, they won't. But hopefully they both succeed in what they need to do, and they're independent, they're proud of themselves, and Vermont, and Vermont was where they were educated. So let's hope that's all good.
I had the privilege of visiting the classroom of Luke Foley, who's Vermont's Teacher of the Year, and I met a young man there who was struggling in school, not because he wasn't able, but because he hadn't found the relevance of what he was learning in the classroom to what he thought he wanted to do with life. And in the context of Luke's class, he worked on a project and ended up building a fantastic resource for his community. He had to talk to legislators, he had to read, state regulations, and really did some incredible work. And he said that what was powerful about it was the opportunity to understand why what you learn in school is actually useful to things that you might do in real life. And it's that relevance piece, understanding the relevance of learning to your future goals and aspirations. Chris, I wondered if you could just give us, we're running out of time, but just give us a little sense of, we need to have these standardized tests, because they do provide us that external audit that we need for public assurance purposes. But what else? I mean, are there other ways to really capture and showcase the strengths of students, and is that part of your work?
I think that's the hope. I mean, I think what you're talking about in terms of relevance is really what we're shooting for. And I mean, we've seen so much of a push in the state, well, from the state level, I think this has been going on behind, at the local level for years and years. But a real push for relevancy and a real push for personalization and visualization of education, and now we have legislation that supports that. And so I think that it's a responsibility at this point to make an accountability system that not just meets the expectations of the field around that, but also reflects current legislation and current policy. So I think everything that we're looking at when we look at an accountability system that incorporates multiple performance measures and also incorporates different types of ways of getting at student proficiency. This is, I think, where we could potentially really see not just a shift in the way that we measure accountability and the way that we measure school performance, but the way that people come to see assessment, as being something punitive versus something that could really help to guide some meaningful conversations at the school level.
And when I think, just to close, when I hear you, what I'm hearing from all of you is how critical the educator is in the center of this process. And again, we can't really test our way into better schools. We can't avoid the critical role that professional judgment and professional skill and expertise plays. Would anyone like to give us a final thought on that? What's the role of professional judgment in ensuring that we are continuously supporting each individual child towards our shared goals? And how do we build that through an accountability
Yeah, I think it's
model?
really key that the assessment, really support that all-important relationship between the teacher, the student, and the parent. And that's really that triangular relationship is really where things happen. So, if the assessment data can inform the teacher, but also have the student with the parent setting goals for themselves in a personal learning plan or some other mechanism to guide their aspirations, I think then we've done a great job in terms of bringing the accountability system down to a place where it actually can make a difference for kids.
And then really bring them out to the community to show what they've done.
Well, I have a feeling we've just begun a conversation, and we're going to continue to have this over the next couple of years, both here but also out in the field with the many schools that we get to visit. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having another conversation.